Okay, welcome to the last lecture, guys. Next week I'll put up a deal for the final. And so here we go. The Brave New World, or the Pax Americanus. And basically I took Pax Americanus from the Pax Romani, where in their sphere of influence, Rome was the major world power, and because they were the uncontested power, basically it allowed commerce and society to flourish, and peace for a little while. And basically, with the collapse of communism, guys, all the rules have to be totally rewritten as we try to figure out what our role in the world should be, or if we should even be in the world. This is kind of like Reconstruction, where the semester started out, where all the rules are being rewritten. Now, speaking of the fall of communism, we got to go to the symbol that collapsed. Basically, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which took place in 1989. And guys, it shocked everybody. You ready to go to the next slide? Well, why did the Berlin Wall fall? Well, basically because communism collapsed in something that surprised everybody because it was so quick and unexpected. The USSR and Eastern Europe had basically been unable to deal with the political and economic changes going on in the world. And to try to face these changes, Mikhail Gorbachev came out with Glasnost and Perestroika, which granted political and religious freedoms, reduced censorship, and even began a small privatization of the industry. So he's trying to reform the system. But what is the cost of this reform? Well, basically, to reduce his costs, they began the military withdrawal of Afghanistan and Eastern Europe. As a consequence of this, in December of 1989, Gorbachev announced that he would not oppose political opposition in Eastern Europe. Poland, they respond by passing a new constitution, opening up a free market economy, and installing in power a non-communist government. And in 1989, after a government official incorrectly announced travel to West Berlin would be permitted, workers reacted by flooding the gates and tearing down the Berlin Wall on the next day. At a meeting at the Malta Conference in December of 1989, Gorbachev announced that the Cold War was over. Now, we in the U.S. rejoice, but the Russian economy continued to crumble. And by the end of 1990, Germany is unified, and the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all declared their independence. Well, are those the only places that are seeing freedom? No. You ready to go to the next slide? In Africa, you had harsh suppressions against anti-apartheid demonstrations declared by South African President P.W. Botha in 1988. Now, what was apartheid? Apartheid basically was the official policy of racial segregation in South Africa. How did President Bush, the elder, respond? Well, he passed harsh economic sanctions on South Africa. Now, why did he pass harsh economic sanctions? Well, in the hopes that if we put an economic squeeze on them, they might change their policies. Kind of like we had done during the American Revolution to the British. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, in Central America, Aid to the Contras was reduced, and negotiations to end the brutal fighting between Nicaraguan and El Salvador began. Indeed, in 1987, you had the Pan-Central American Contradora Plan, where 5 Central American nations called for a Central American ceasefire and diplomatic reforms. Getting ready to go to the next slide. So what are the results of all of this? Well, in South Africa, we have a new South African president, F.W. de Klerk, who worked with Nelson Mandela and other Africans to bring forth multiracial free elections. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected their president. In Central America, in 1990, democratic elections were held in Nicaragua, and the Civil War in El Salvador ended. In Russia, declining economic status caused major unrest. You had a lot of communist hardliners that tried to take over the government on August 19th, 1991. And Boris Yeltsin, a man who had earlier argued against Gorbachev's reforms, led 150,000 Muscovites to surround parliament and not give in. And the military coup failed. And Gorbachev is released. And by 1992, Boris Yeltsin is in power of a confederated government of republics. Now, guys, why do you think that the communists would have wanted to go back to communism after they had had a taste of freedom? Well, I mean, think about it, guys. If you had sacrificed so much under the communist system, but now you're free, well, who's going to pay for your retirement? Who's going to pay for your medical care? Who's going to pay for your housing? Because, you know, and if you're old, you don't have the time and the opportunity to build all that up. So a lot of people were scared. In times of economic duress, a lot of people are willing to give up some of their freedom and liberties. Ready to go to the next slide? Here's basically the confederated nations I was talking about. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, with all of this freedom going on, is freedom going on everywhere? No, we have some possible setbacks. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Like in China, you had democratic movements that began in Beijing in 1989 that made up of university students and pro-democracy protesters demanding political change. This whole movement collected in an area named Tiananmen Square that since the time of the emperors in China had been a free speech area. And amongst their signs and cries for freedom, the students erected a goddess of liberty. There you see a picture of her right there. To remind you of anything? Kind of like the Statue of Liberty. And you had television cameras broadcasting these events to America. And basically the Chinese army didn't do anything, so you had more protesters gather, and the government is doing nothing. And many of the leaders and the world just watches. And China didn't do anything till people were kind of asleep. And on June 4th, 1989, the Chinese government no longer waited. Troops moved in and arrested many of the leaders of the movement. Thousands were killed or wounded. Indeed, there, a picture right there is who I consider the bravest man in the world. You can YouTube a video of like try Chinese man stands against tanks. We have no idea who that is. And guys, it's so funny because he did this, the tank stopped, but nobody else went out to join him. Well, how's Bush going to respond to this thing? Well, basically, they criticized China, but we were unwilling to impose sanctions, fearing that it might make China more oppressive and isolationistic. And our relations with them had begun to thaw. Next slide. Meanwhile, in Yugoslavia, in 1991, Yugoslavia, an economically and ethnically troubled land, broke apart. Basically, the multitude of cultures that had been tenuously tied together in Yugoslavia were no longer able to bear union. And you had a series of bloody ethnic conflicts ensued that by 1994 left more than 100,000 dead. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. Threats in the midst of freedom. Guys, basically with the Cold War over, many hoped for a peace dividend where money could be taken from the military and instead invested into social problems. What's the problem with this though? Is basically the world needed the economic and military strength of the U.S. Now, what were some threats? Well, problems looming on the horizon were third world poverty, tensions in the Middle East, and drugs. Getting ready to go to the next slide. And speaking of drugs, we'll start out with Panama. Basically, Manuel Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama, he had been on the CIA's payroll as an informant on the Colombian drug traffic. But basically, guys, he'd gotten too corrupt. And in December of 1989, Operation Just Cause was launched to arrest Noriega and to try to stop the drug traffic flowing through his country. Panama was invaded, and within 72 hours, both the country and Nicaragua are in America's control, at the cost of 23 Americans and more than 3,000 Panamanians. And even though Noriega was found guilty in 1992, basically Panama remained a major drug highway. Ready for the next slide? Meanwhile, in the Middle East, in the fall of 1990, Saddam Hussein, who once again used to be one of our buds, just like Noriega, just like the Taliban, basically Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait under the justification of economic war by Kuwait against Iraq. Now, of course, many people were worried that Saddam wanted to dominate the Persian Gulf, and by doing so, being able to control more than 40% of the world's supply of oil. So within hours, a multinational force of more than 700,000 is organized, 500,000 of which were Americans. They were all moved to Saudi Arabia in what was called Operation Desert Shield, and delivered the warning to Saddam Hussein that they would have to pull up. They'd had basically until January 15th, 1991 to leave Kuwait, or the Allies would have to use force to evict them. And so basically we gave him quite a bit of time to get the troops out of Kuwait. Now, why do you think the UN, because this was a UN operation, why do you think the UN gave them that amount of time? Well, not only did it look nice in the eyes of the world, but also remember, we had to get all the tanks, all the grease needed for those tanks, all the gasoline for those tanks, every single screw, every single tool, every single thing that the soldiers might eat, every carrot, every banana, every peanut. We had to take over all their socks, all their clothes, all their guns, all their bullets, everything like that. Everything we needed to get over there. So basically, this time deadline was advantageous both to Saddam Hussein so that he could pull out and everything like that, but it was also good for the UN, giving them time to prepare for this invasion. And so we waited, and January 15th came, and we didn't invade. Well, for 18 hours. Then, all of a sudden, a massive aerial assault began, which basically devastated Iraqi forces in Kuwait and Iraq. For more than 40 days, these attacks continued. And basically, we were knocking out all of their infrastructure, hitting their towers of communication, hitting their roads, hitting the waterways, just decimating everything. And on February 23rd, Operation Desert Storm began, where our ground troops move in, and within 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated, and the condition of the Iraqi forces told full well the effect of our air supremacy. You had thousands of Iraqi casualties that were also telling. I mean, Iraqi losses ranged from 70,000 to 115,000 killed. Meanwhile, the United States lost less than 150. However, once Kuwait was liberated, Saddam remained. We didn't go in and invade Iraq. Why? Because this was a UN operation and a UN coalition that did this. And our whole purpose for doing it was to liberate Kuwait. So on the bad side, a lot of the people that we promised, hey, revolt against Saddam Hussein and we got your back, well, we didn't. Ready for the next slide? What might have been a consequence about that? Well, maybe. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Making new choices. Alright, ready for the next slide? And something we had already talked about in the last lecture, the slowing economy. Basically, from World War II to the 1970s had been the largest period of constant economic growth in America. Our gross national product and productivity rose at a rate higher than 2.5%. Our economy was expanding, poverty was declining, but then we hit the 1970s. That whole growth rate slowed down. Now, why is that? Well, first off, America is shifting from an industrial-based economy to an information computer-based economy. Many of the industrial jobs we had were lost as knowledge workers. These are people like engineers, clerks, teachers, accountants. Those things expand. Indeed, many in the face of world competition, a lot of companies began to downsize. For families, it became more and more, they found it more useful, often necessary, for both adults to work. Poverty increased by as much as 15% by 1993. And as the knowledge-based economy rewarded those with higher levels of education, the numbers of doctors and lawyers increased by 50%, while the middle class and professional positions began to disappear. Workers younger than 25 years old saw their incomes fall nearly 19%. Indeed, by 1992, McDonald's was one of the largest private employers in the nation. And by 1995, fast food restaurants employed more than 2.3 million workers, the majority of which earned no more than minimum wage, which back in 1995 was only $5.15 an hour. And in fact, the average family earned as much in real wages as the average family of 1973, except now both parents have to work. Ready to go to the next slide? The face of poverty. Well, the bottom of America's economic ladder felt the slowing of the economy first. The number of people in poverty climbed 23% in the mid-1970s. By 1994, the income of the 15% of Americans was less than $14,335 for a family of four, which of course was below the poverty line back then. And for minority families, conditions were worse, with African Americans representing 30% and Hispanic families making 26% of those living in poverty. But just so you know, in 1996, the median family income for blacks increased 13.4% from 1993, and the median income for Hispanics increased 5%. But perhaps most distressing during this period was what's known as the feminization of poverty. By this is the fact that by the early 1990s, 31.1% of women who filed as head of household lived in poverty. And by 1992, women only earned an average of 76 cents for every dollar an average man worked. Now, you did have new divorce settlements that greatly reduced the amounts of economic support by the husbands, and awards of alimony were less frequent. Child support payments were both small, and enforcement was lax, making sure that payments were made. And basically, by 1990, more than a fourth of spouses who owed child support paid nothing. But guys, just to let you know, currently in Texas, they do an excellent job of making, as a divorced man, I can tell you, child support is enforced now in the state of Texas. Ready? Next slide. The urban crisis. Well, poverty was most noticeable in urban areas, as during the 1980s, more people that were living in the cities moved to the suburbs, taking their jobs with them, as well as their higher paid employees, which did include minorities, and basically took them out into integrated communities in the suburbs. So now basically you had cities that had to do more with less money. And the frustrations in the cities led to increasing dropout rates, violence, drug use. And basically you see a bigger deterioration of the inner cities. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, while I may sound all doom and gloom and everything like that, America is still an incredible place of opportunity. So it should come as no surprise that despite the limitations, you had a new flow of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean arrive on our shores. You had a rise of Asian Americans in very places like Hawaii and the Pacific Coast region that skyrocketed. And as many were educated, They found more successful jobs, as well as easier assimilation. You also had a rise of Latin American, which kind of had the opposite effect, where assimilation was more difficult because there was a lack of skilled jobs that kept many Latino immigrants near the bottom of the social ladder. Even though in 1986 the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, that did give some citizenship and wanted to stem the tide of illegal immigration. But, as you guess, little was actually done. Next slide. The politics of morality. Well, with many fearing the changes that were taking place in America, you had conservatives beginning to believe that America had become a nation of interest groups clamoring for the rights and power, while a sense of national identity and purpose was rapidly fading. Which, of course, caused a lot of fear. Ready for the next slide? Well, basically, what are you going to blame this on? Well, many place the blame for America's ills on the breakdown of morals sprung out of the 60s social movements, like the women's movement, the counterculture, the sexual revolution. And indeed, talking about the sexual revolution, by the 1970s, you had more than half the people surveyed that thought that premarital sex or cohabitation was okay. And in society, marriage had kind of lost its importance. You had many people deciding to put off marriage until their late 20s, with couples limiting their family size to like 2 kids. With divorce, by the 70s, divorce had become more and more commonplace. And you had the introduction of no-fault divorces, where basically a divorce would be granted without wrongdoing done by either side. Indeed, by the 80s and 90s, more than half of all marriages end in divorce. Now, studies are presented about the negative effects to children, causing some communities to require couples to attend premarital counseling before marriage. Because we had to keep the family together. Are we ready for the next slide? So what's the effect on families? Well, guys, it's nothing. The families of the 80s and 90s is nothing like the stereotypical family of the 50s. You have an increase of single-family households and houses where both spouses have to work. TVs reflect this change instead of like Leave It to Beaver. By 1997, the popular comedies are like Cosby, Mad About You, and The Simpsons, where you also have popular single-family shows like Grace Under Fire and Ellen. And then you have others that have nothing to do whatsoever with marriage, like Seinfeld or Friends. Violence and sexual content also became more prevalent in entertainment. Why? Well, because one thing that they now had competition with was cable TV. And later on, it would become satellite TV. So they have to compete with those, so they might show a little more skin, might throw out a curse word. Now, to try to stem unwanted material from reaching children, entertainment companies responded with a rating system. They were helped out by Tipper Gore, the wife of Al Gore. Now, why would the companies begin this rating system? Well, basically, they began it themselves because they didn't want government doing it, because the government is much less flexible than a private group. Also, you have the beginnings of the internet that sprouted attempts to limit sexually offensive material from the internet. But this was found unconstitutional in the case of the Supreme Court. It was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the case of Reno v. the ACLU. Ready for the next slide? Alright, the women's movement. Basically, by the 1970s, the second wave of feminism began that wanted equality of opportunity as well as equality under the law. This push for equality forced Title IX of the Higher Education Act of 1972 on coeducational colleges. Basically, it banned discrimination from the sports it offered. So for however much they spend on male sports, they have to spend the same amount on women's sports. Which, if you think about it, is a publicly funded school. If I had a daughter, I'd want there to be just as much spent on her as there were for boys. By the 1980s, more women are in politics and in the professions, thereby shortening the pay gap. And indeed, by the 1980s, more women are receiving bachelor degrees than men, a trend that continues to this day. Excuse me. What's the state's response to women's rights? Well, they modified some laws to reduce or eliminate gender discrimination within the laws and marketplace. Some liberalized abortion laws, allowing women to seek legal abortions. And in 1967, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, and others called for an Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, that would eliminated laws and restrictions that blocked women's achievement of equality at the state level. Getting ready to go to the next slide. And while the ERA quickly passed through 33 of the 38 states they needed for passing the law, a conservative movement led by Phyllis Schlafly rose up against it. And even though this is the first and only constitutional amendment, because it used to be they would give you a year to get 3/4 of the states to agree for that amendment, well, because as it was getting towards the end of that year, they gave this a 6 months extension in an attempt to try to get it passed. But even that, it fell short. And it wasn't able to do it because the conservative forces rose in an effective Stop the ERA movement, warning about its threat to family values. Phyllis Schlafly was one of her most vocal leaders. They believe that this amendment would destroy the American family. Okay. Ready to go to the next slide? Okay. Abortion. Basically, in 1973, in a 5-2 decision in the Supreme Court of Roe v. Wade, it invalidated a Texas law that prevented abortion. Indeed, the Wade in Roe v. Wade was our district attorney in the city of Dallas, Henry Wade. Anyway, this ruling that women had the right to privacy gave women the right for an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy. This decision struck down anti-abortion laws in 46 states, resulting in legal abortions rising from 750,000 in 1973 to nearly 1.5 million by 1980. Now, of course, you had the Rights to Life movement that organized from multi-denominational members to oppose abortion rights on both moral as well as legal grounds. What were some of the effects of this opposition? Well, in 1976, the Hyde Amendment was passed, which prohibited the abortion right, which prohibited the use of Medicare funds to pay for abortions. This decision was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1980 decision of Harris v. McRae. And many thought that abortion might be on the ropes, especially after President Ronald Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to the bench. But in the 1992 decision of Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania v. Casey, it upheld a woman's right to an abortion, even though it did assert that in some cases the states could modify that right. Basically, the court upheld the Pennsylvania law that said that women must wait 24 hours before they had an abortion, and that minors needed to inform their parents before having an abortion. But the court did not approve a section that required women where they had to tell their husbands of an abortion. And by 1997, all but 10 states in the District of Columbia had enacted some restrictions on the rights of a minor to have an abortion. Now, you had also abortion clinics, doctors, staff, and patients becoming targets of violence and intimidation, and more than 100 clinics were targets of arson or bombing by some willing to use terrorism to halt abortion. The government responded by passing the Freedom of Access to Clinics Entrances Act in 1994, which restricted the tactics of pro-life supporters. So then again, in response to that, because now they couldn't stand in front of the abortion clinics, you had Operation Rescue. That basically would hang up big posters of aborted fetuses and everything like that. On to the next slide. And sexual harassment, we vaulted this into the forefront where a Senate confirmation hearings regarding Supreme Court Justice nominee Clarence Thomas in 1991. Anita Hill, a University of Oklahoma law professor, claimed that Thomas had sexually harassed her when they both worked together at the Department of Education 10 years prior. This caused it to become a very prominent theme during the hearings. And in response, in 1994, Congress passed the Violence Against Women's Act that basically provided federal funds and support to more harshly punish sexual violence and attacks on women. The Supreme Court then further defined sexual harassment to not only include verbal and physical conduct, but also the creation of a hostile work environment. Now, with all those gains, was feminism in trouble? Well, by the mid-1990s, many women were trying to balance work and family, claiming too many feminists were anti-marriage and anti-family and out of touch with the needs of modern women. Some women's rights activists like Betty Friedman began to critically attack what they called gender feminists. Indeed, by 1995, only 20% of college freshmen accepted the label feminist. And by 2005, the largest attractor of college women were the college Republicans. This in turn forced many within the feminist movement to reorganize their choices and help promote a woman-friendly and family-friendly group. And, getting ready to go to the next slide. I mean, you do see some advances, like if you go into a men's bathroom, you'll see a koala baby changing station there. And like I said, there are more women receiving bachelor's degrees than men, attaining positions in both politics as well as business. Ready for the next slide? Alright, gay rights, progress, and resistance. Homosexuals basically began to fight for inclusion aggressively since the late 1960s. Now, this first fight began in 1958 when the Postmaster General said that it would not send a conservative gay magazine called One through the mail. Basically, it was a British magazine that didn't have any pictures, just had articles about the gay lifestyle. And like I said, it was a British magazine. The magazine sued and took the case to the Supreme Court, and they won. Now, what were the ramifications of allowing sexual material to be transferred through the mail? Well, one young guy from Chicago kind of got an idea and went on and made a magazine that was much more, published a magazine, distributed through the mail, that was much more graphic in nudity. And by the way, this young Chicagoan, his name was Hugh Hefner, and the magazine that he came out with was Playboy. And so Playboy was allowed to be delivered because of a homosexual magazine. Now, by the 1970s, the gay right movement had organized and expanded and even begun to pressure government at all levels to end restrictions against homosexuals in employment, housing, and the military. And although the majority of Americans believed homosexuality to be wrong, this pressure continued. By 1973, the American Psychiatric Association ended its classification that homosexuality was a mental disorder. By 1984, the United States Council of Mayors called for legal protection of homosexual rights at all levels. But of course, as progress grew, so did retrenchment. For example, in 1985, the Massachusetts voters rejected a homosexual Bill of Rights. Reagan, his administration equated homosexuality with disease. And in 1986, Pope John Paul II instructed American bishops to stop supporting gay rights and labeled homosexuality a disease. Well, what caused a change where homosexuality had to be confronted? Getting ready to go to the next slide. AIDS, or the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. By 1981, AIDS had made its way to the U.S. Indeed, by 1991, more than 195,700 cases had been reported, with 97,000 dying, and 1.5 million more estimated to be infected with HIV, or the human immunodeficiency virus, which develops into AIDS in about 10 to 11 years. And once AIDS is reached, the chance of surviving more than 3 years was only 1 in 10. Now, AIDS forced the homosexual movement in two ways. At first, fear of AIDS lessened support for gay rights among many Americans. AIDS caused many homosexuals to have to become more vocal in the gay right movement. But then something happened. Heterosexuals started getting AIDS. So what happened that caused people to start to think differently, and how are we going to fight against this? Well, some people believed that we needed to start putting out a message like practice safe sex. So in other words, use condoms, use clean drug needles to try to reduce the new numbers. Other groups said, no, just don't have sex at all, abstinence, and be faithful in your marriage or have fidelity, and just say no to drugs. Now, combined, what were the effects of this? Well, by 1996, there were 280,000 Americans dead of AIDS, but the new cases were significantly decreased. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Federal intervention and the courts. By the 1980s, many Americans began to respond against the continuation of federal programs that had been put in place to help equalize social and economic relationships. You had a lot of people that began to argue that multiculturalism and federal intervention in support of minority rights was weakening American society and undermining traditional values like the freedom of action or merit-based achievement. Two big targets of this were affirmative action and busing. Now in busing, the first actions took place in the early 1970s when non-Southern school districts had to adopt busing to achieve more equally balanced schools. In other words, you would bring minorities in from outside the school district to try to have a more diverse student population. Boston reacted with violent protests in 1974, resulting in 20,000 white students leaving the public school system. There you see a guy in Boston that's trying to go against a protester using the American flag. Now these actions seem to be bolstered by Ronald Reagan, who stated that we aren't going to compel children to go where they don't have to. We don't want to compel children who don't want to have an integrated education to have one. In affirmative action, basically as the economy slowed and many of the middle and blue-collar jobs began to disappear, they believed that affirmative action programs limited the economic and educational possibilities of others. So in 1978, the Regents of the University of California v. Bach case was heard, in which Alan Bach sued UC Davis's School of Medicine as he had been denied admission and black students who were less qualified than him had been admitted. Basically, he cried out that he was a victim of reverse discrimination, which can be defined as discrimination against members of a dominant group. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and the federal government began to tighten affirmative action guidelines and began to abolish or limit many of the federal programs, especially those based on a racial quota system. Indeed, in 1997, California abolished racial or gender preferences in hiring, college admissions, or contracting. And indeed, Business Week in 1991 said that basically compensating for past discrimination against some people can create fresh discrimination against others. So how are we faring today? Getting ready to go to the next slide. Basically, you're seeing a conservative push. By 1992, the Supreme Court restricted criminal rights, approved the reinstatement of the death penalty, and ruled that busing should no longer be used to integrate schools that were segregated by de facto housing patterns. In other words, you didn't have to bring in populations from outside of the school district. All right, and that's the final lecture, guys.